I remember the exact moment I stopped being seen. It wasn't dramatic. No shouting, no slammed doors, just my husband pointing toward the far corner of our bedroom and saying, "Stand there. You're distracting me." It was 5:43 in the morning. Ethan was already in his tailored navy suit, the one that made him look like he belonged to a world I'd only helped him enter. His reflection in the mirror looked confident, polished, untouchable. He was rehearsing a speech for that night's event, the annual gala for Ardent Systems, the company we'd built together from scratch in a 2-bedroom apartment with flickering lights and second-hand desks. "I just need to focus," he said without meeting my eyes. "This crowd expects a different kind of presence than you're used to. They're global investors, real players." I didn't answer. I watched him smooth his tie with those same hands that used to tremble over coffee mugs at 3 in the morning when we were writing code on my laptop, praying the servers wouldn't crash. 3 years ago, he couldn't speak to an investor without breaking into a sweat. Back then I would stand behind him, whispering encouragements, rewriting his slides, cutting the fluff. He'd look at me like I was his anchor. Now I was a distraction. He didn't see me notice the invitation on the dresser. The Ardent Systems Global Vision Gala, attendees, executive board and guests. Only one name was listed under founder. His. Mine had quietly disappeared. The way a watermark fades when it's exposed to too much light. I remember whispering, "Do you want me there tonight?" Even though I already knew the answer. He kept practicing his smile in the mirror and said, "It's better if you don't come. This is a certain kind of crowd." That word, certain, carried 100 unspoken judgments. He didn't want me there because I didn't fit the new version of his life. I wasn't the polished kind of woman who could talk about yacht clubs or wine vintages without hesitation. I was the woman who wrote the first line of the software that had made him rich. He went back to his reflection, tilting his head, practicing charm like it was a language I no longer spoke. The sound of his rehearsed laughter, so hollow, so unfamiliar, filled the room. That was when I realized he'd already left me. His body was still here, but the man I'd built a life with had turned into someone who looked at me and saw a liability. When he left for the office, the silence pressed against the walls like a physical thing. The apartment we'd chosen together, once cluttered with our late-night energy drinks and notebooks, had become sterile. Every surface gleamed, every detail curated to impress. And I had been the one to curate it. I made coffee out of habit, not desire, and sat by the window overlooking the Chicago skyline. It looked sharp and cold like glass pretending to be sky. My phone buzzed with a message from Maya Torres, a friend from my old consulting firm. Someone who joined Ardent after I recommended her. No words, just a screenshot. A corporate document labeled, Event Strategy, Attendance Optimization. Under it, a note that sliced through me like a paper cut. Spousal participation limited to individuals aligned with executive image standards. R. Ellis does not currently reflect Ardent's global brand. R. Ellis. My name reduced to a line item. Family advisory input. Required. That was Ethan's parents. The kind of people who said things like, "We just want what's best for the company," when what they really meant was, "You're not one of us." The coffee went cold. My hands were shaking too hard to drink it. It wasn't just that I'd been excluded, it was that my exclusion had been approved, documented, signed, strategically justified. Somewhere, a boardroom full of people had discussed my worth like it was a branding risk. By the time the sun came up fully, the decision was made for me. I packed a bag. Not dramatically, not out of spite. Just a quiet final act. Jeans. Old sneakers. A sweatshirt Ethan had once called too ordinary. The things that felt like me. On the counter, I left my key next to the embossed invitation with only his name. No note. No explanation. The city was waking up as I drove toward the coast, gray clouds dissolving over Lake Michigan. For the first time in years, I didn't check my email. Didn't calculate, didn't plan, didn't care. I just drove, past suburbs and gas stations, through miles of highway where no one knew my name. Somewhere past Milwaukee, I pulled over to watch the sun slip into the water. It looked like fire sinking into glass. The horizon didn't care who had been invited to a gala. It didn't care about image or sophistication or strategic positioning. Just existed. And maybe for the first time that's all I wanted to. The farther I drove, the quieter the world became. City noise fell behind me mile by mile, until it sounded like something that had only existed in a dream. I didn't have a plan, just a direction. West. Toward the edge of the map. By the time I crossed into Wisconsin, the sky had turned the color of steel. I rolled down the window, and the cold wind hit my face with a sharpness that felt almost personal. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I owed anyone an answer. Just outside a small town called Riverside Bluff, I saw a weathered sign that read cabins for rent, ocean view. The irony made me laugh. We were still miles from the actual coast, but I followed the arrow anyway. It led to a row of wooden cottages overlooking a lake that shimmered like glass in the fading light. The woman who stepped out to meet me looked like she belonged to this landscape. Strong hands, paint stains on her sleeves, gray hair tied in a messy braid. "You look like someone who forgot what silence sounds like," she said, not unkindly. "I think I did," I admitted. Her name was Lydia Vale, and the place was hers. She handed me a heavy brass key attached to a piece of driftwood. "Number 4. It's got the best view." Heat's temperamental, but the sound of the water makes up for it. The cabin creaked when I stepped inside, as if it was acknowledging me. The air smelled faintly of cedar and sea salt, even though the ocean was still hours away. There was a small wood-burning stove, mismatched furniture, and a window that framed the lake like a painting. I set my bag down and felt something shift inside me. Something small but real. Lydia reappeared at the door holding a bottle of wine. Local. From a vineyard run by people who still believe grapes taste better when you let them breathe. "You'll need this more than heat tonight." When she left, the silence returned full and alive. I sat on the old couch with the wine and stared at the reflection of the moon trembling on the water. It felt like the first honest moment I'd had in years. I turned off my phone and slid it into the bottom drawer of the dresser. Not just airplane mode off. The way you turn off a machine that's been controlling you for too long. That night, the quiet had its own sound. Wine through the trees, water tapping against the rocks, the faint crackle of the fire. I fell asleep without meaning to, still in my jeans, wrapped in a blanket that smelled faintly of pine and old books. When I woke, sunlight was spilling across the floor like spilled honey. For a moment I forgot where I was. Then I remembered and smiled. No schedule. No investor decks. No strategic presence. I brewed coffee in a dented percolator I found on a shelf, its handle worn smooth by other hands. It took longer than any coffee maker I'd ever owned, and it tasted better than any I'd made. Outside, the lake looked infinite. I walked down to the water's edge, shoes in hand, the cold biting my feet awake. The air smelled of damp wood and possibility. A heron lifted off from the reeds, its wings slow and deliberate, and I felt an unexpected envy of its single, unbroken motion. No meetings. No explanations. Just instinct and direction. I stayed by the water until my fingers went numb, then returned to the cabin, where the fire had gone out but the air still held its warmth. For the first time in years, my thoughts weren't loops of planning or justification. They were just mine. That evening, Lydia knocked softly before coming in, holding 2 mugs of something that smelled herbal and unfamiliar. "Chamomile and sage," she said. "It helps people stop thinking about what they left behind." We sat by the window as the sky turned the color of bruised lavender. After a while, she asked, "You running from something or toward something?" "I'm not sure yet," I said. "That's fine," she answered. "Most people don't realize they're the same thing." She left me with the mugs and a small smile that carried a kind of knowing I couldn't define. When she was gone, I looked out at the darkening water and thought, maybe peace isn't the absence of noise. Maybe it's the moment you stop needing to be heard. I fell asleep again that night without checking my phone, without imagining what Ethan was doing, who he was charming, or how many people were pretending not to notice my absence. Somewhere between the creak of the cabin and the rhythm of the lake, I realized that leaving hadn't been an escape. It had been a return. Days started to blend together. Not in a dull way but like brushstrokes melting into one another on a canvas. Each morning began with the same soft ritual. Light spilling through the curtains, the smell of damp wood, and the distant call of birds that had no deadlines. I stopped counting time in hours. Instead, I measured it by the way sunlight shifted across the floor, or how long the fire took to catch each evening. There was something sacred about that, a life without metrics. Lydia would stop by sometimes with her mug of tea and her quiet humor. She never asked about my past, though I'm sure she knew pieces of it from the way I hesitated before answering simple questions. Instead, she'd talk about her garden, her paintings, or the local fishermen who still refused to use GPS because, as she said, trusting your gut keeps your soul awake. One morning she handed me a small notebook, its cover worn and soft as fabric. "Found it in the drawer when I fixed the heater," she said. "Thought you might want to use it." First, I didn't. Writing had always been something I did for strategy decks for clients for Ethan's speeches, never for myself. But that evening, with the wind pressing against the cabin walls, I opened the notebook and wrote a single line. I existed before he looked at me. It was messy, uneven, almost childlike. But something inside me loosened. The next night I wrote more, not about him but about the feeling of unfolding. The rhythm of water. The smell of rain before it starts. The way silence can feel like a heartbeat when you finally stop trying to fill it. Lydia saw the notebook once, lying open on the table. She didn't read it, just smiled and said, "You're remembering your language." I think she meant the part of me that spoke without permission. I started walking every day after breakfast. Sometimes along the lake's edge, sometimes down the old logging road that led into a grove of maples. The world had texture again, bark rough against my palms, the squeak of wet sand under my shoes, the chill that bit through my jacket. I began taking photos with an old camera I'd found in a thrift shop in town. It didn't have Wi-Fi or filters. Every picture had to be earned, a click, a pause, a wait. When the first roll was developed, the photos came back imperfect. Crooked horizons, light leaks, fingerprints. But they were alive. One afternoon, while pinning them to the wall, I realized they all had one thing in common: space. No people, no noise, just breath. That's what I'd been craving all along, room to breathe without being evaluated. Weeks passed like that, quietly generous. I started cooking again, not for presentation but for taste. Simple food. Bread with herbs, soup made from whatever Lydia brought from the farmer's market. The act of eating without urgency felt revolutionary. Then one gray morning, I found an envelope slipped under my door. No return address. Just my name in handwriting I didn't recognize. Inside was a clipping from a local newspaper. A photo of Ethan at the Ardent Systems Leadership Summit. He stood behind a podium smiling, but something about his posture was off, too stiff, too strained. The article headline read, "Ardent faces scrutiny after anonymous leak of internal communications." My stomach tightened. It didn't mention me by name, but the subtext was there: leadership image inconsistencies, allegations of exclusionary practices, corporate language trying to wrap itself around shame. I folded the paper once, then again, and set it aside. My hands didn't shake. For the first time, the idea of his world falling apart didn't thrill me or hurt me. It simply felt distant, like watching a storm move across a lake that wasn't mine anymore. That night, Lydia brought over a lantern and said, "Power's out again. Storm's rolling in from the west." We sat together by the window, watching lightning flash across the horizon. "Ever notice," she said softly, "how storms look violent from a distance, but up close, they're mostly just wind rearranging what needed moving anyway?" I thought about the newspaper, about Ethan's carefully built empire wobbling under its own weight. Maybe this was that, the rearranging. Not revenge. Not justice. Just correction. When the thunder finally faded, Lydia went home, and I sat alone in the candlelight. I picked up my notebook and wrote another line. Sometimes the collapse is the sound of truth finally landing. And for the first time I realized I didn't need to be part of his downfall to feel free. Freedom was already here. Quiet. Steady. Mine. The first sound that broke the silence wasn't thunder or wind. It was a vibration. A faint metallic hum from the drawer where I had buried my phone weeks ago. For a moment I didn't move. The cabin had been my refuge from everything digital. No notifications, no calls, no curated perfection. But now that vibration felt like something alive, clawing its way back into my world. I opened the drawer slowly, as if afraid it might bite. The phone's black screen reflected my face, softer, sun-touched, unfamiliar. When I turned it on, a flood of messages appeared. Each one time-stamped, stacked like a tower of urgency. The first was from Maya, the only person I hadn't blocked before disappearing. "Rachel, you need to see this. Call me." Then one from a number I didn't recognize. They're looking for you. Press. Legal. HR. It's all coming out. I scrolled, heartbeat rising in my throat. Screenshots. Articles. News headlines. Ardent Systems, once a symbol of glossy ambition, was unraveling in public view. A journalist had leaked internal memos, the same kind that once erased my name. Words like optics management, executive image compliance, marital optics liability, flashed across the screen like wounds. I didn't need to read between the lines. They were talking about me, about the woman who had been written out to make room for a cleaner story. I dropped the phone onto the table. The screen kept lighting up with notifications, each one louder than the last. It was as if my silence had been replaced with the sound of everything I'd left behind catching fire. I stepped outside. The air was heavy with the smell of rain, clouds rolling low over the lake. Lydia was on her porch, painting with wide, deliberate strokes. She looked up, then studied my face. You saw it, didn't you? I nodded. It's everywhere. She set her brush down. Do you feel vindicated? The question hit harder than I expected. Did I? Maybe once I would have, back when I still needed proof that I'd mattered. But now, standing under that bruised sky, I just felt detached. Like the storm was happening on another shore entirely. I don't know what I feel, I said. That's the right answer, Lydia said, wiping her hands on a cloth. You don't owe that story your emotions anymore. Back inside, I watched the rain start. The first drops hit the window like soft punctuation marks. The phone kept buzzing until finally, the sound blended with the rain, rhythmic, almost hypnotic. When I finally checked again, there was one new message from a name I hadn't seen in months. Ethan. Rachel. Please. You need to talk to me. None of this was supposed to happen. I stared at the words until they blurred. For years I've been the one sending messages like that, pleading for understanding, for time, for kindness. Now he was the one trying to reach through the silence I'd built. I didn't reply. Instead, I wrote his name on a scrap of paper, folded it once, and dropped it into the fire. It burned fast. A thin, bright flame, gone before the next raindrop hit the roof. That night, the storm deepened. The power flickered, the walls creaked, and every sound seemed amplified. Branches scraping the windows, the rhythmic thud of rain. I lay awake, listening, waiting for something to break. But nothing did. The world outside could collapse, and yet the cabin, my small world, stayed intact. By morning, the lake had turned silver, calm again, as if the storm had never existed. The phone lay on the table, dark and quiet. I didn't turn it back on. Instead, I opened my notebook and wrote, "When the noise returns, listen closely. Sometimes it's not calling you back, it's testing if you've really left." Then I closed the cover and let the day begin. Not with chaos, but with choice. It happened on a morning so calm that it almost felt staged. The lake was still, the kind of stillness that makes you believe time has stopped to listen. Lydia had gone into town early, leaving me alone with the soft hum of the stove and the scratch of a pencil against my notebook. Then a knock. 3 slow, deliberate taps. It wasn't the mailman. He always shouted from the porch. This sound had weight, hesitation. When I opened the door, he was standing there. Ethan. But not the Ethan I remembered. Not the man in tailored suits, rehearsing smiles in hotel mirrors. This version looked smaller, his edges dulled. Rain had darkened his coat, and his eyes, once so certain, seemed lost in their own reflection. "Hi," he said, his voice thinner than I remembered. "You're hard to find." "I meant to be," I replied. He glanced past me into the cabin, taking in the mismatched furniture, the smell of wood smoke, the half-open notebook on the table. "This is where you've been?" he asked quietly, almost to himself. "This is where I started remembering how to breathe." He nodded, but his jaw tightened. "They're destroying everything, Rachel. Ardent, it's collapsing. Investors are gone, the board's fractured, and my father." He stopped, swallowing whatever word came next. "I saw the headlines," I said. "It was bound to happen." His expression flickered, confusion, then disbelief. "You don't care." "I used to," I said. "Back when I thought I had something to prove." He stepped closer, and for a second I could smell the city on him, sharp cologne and exhaustion. "Everything we built. It's slipping away. I don't even know who leaked the documents. People are saying it was you." I let the silence hang there until it became heavy. I didn't need to, I finally said. You wrote your own leak when you erased me. The words landed between us like glass breaking, quiet, final. He looked down, nodding as if he'd expected it. You were the best part of it, he said softly. And I treated you like a prop. I don't know why I did that. I do, I said. You thought success needed a cleaner mirror. Something that didn't remind you where it began. He looked at me then, really looked, and I saw the flicker of the man I once knew. The one who used to whisper plans over burnt coffee and bad code at 3 in the morning. But he wasn't that man anymore. And I wasn't the woman who waited for him to return. He stepped back, glancing toward the lake. You don't want to come back, do you? No, I said simply. And neither should you. Go find who you are without the noise. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The wind moved through the trees, and the sound filled the space words couldn't reach. Finally, he said, You look peaceful. I am, I answered. It's strange, isn't it? Peace feels heavier than anger at first. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. I just needed to see you once more. To know you're okay. I am, I said again. Now go be okay too. He nodded, then turned toward his car. The same sleek one I'd once picked out with him, now dulled by dust and rain. He drove off without looking back. No music, no drama. Just the sound of tires fading into distance. When the last trace of him disappeared behind the trees, I went back inside and closed the door. The cabin was warm again, alive with its familiar hum. I sat down and wrote in the notebook. Sometimes closure isn't a conversation. It's the sound of a door closing quietly behind the person who finally stopped belonging to your story. Outside, the lake rippled with light. The world hadn't changed, but I had. And that was enough. The days after Ethan's visit felt different. Not heavier, not lighter, just true. There was no dramatic rush of relief. No cinematic closure. Only a quiet rearranging inside me, as if the air had learned a new way to move through my lungs. The world outside went on untouched. The lake breathed in its steady rhythm. The trees whispered their small conversations, and Lydia's laugh echoed from her porch as she scolded her cat for stealing her paintbrush again. Life had continued, and somehow so had I. I started walking farther each morning, past the dock, into the fields that stretched behind the cabins. The air there smelled of wet earth and wild mint. Sometimes I'd find feathers caught in the grass or broken shells left by birds. Small evidence that even fragile things can leave their mark. One evening, Lydia brought a package to my door. No return address, she said, handing it over with that knowing smile she always wore when she didn't want to ask questions. Inside was a thin manila folder. A legal notice. Ardent Systems had officially dissolved. No press release, no statement. Just a quiet closure stamped in bureaucratic ink. I stared at the paper for a long time, tracing the faded company logo with my finger. It used to mean everything: ambition, purpose, identity. Now it was just a memory that no longer hurt. I fed the pages one by one into the fire. They burned cleanly, curling into thin silver ash that drifted upward like unspoken apologies. After that night, something opened inside me. A space I didn't know I'd been saving. I began sketching again. At first, clumsy lines, uncertain forms. Then, gradually, shapes with breath and movement. Lydia saw them one day and said, "You should show these. The gallery downtown takes local submissions." I laughed. "I'm not an artist." She shrugged. "You're human. That's close enough." So I did. And a month later, the same small gallery that once ignored my resume emails hung 3 of my pieces on its back wall. No fanfare, no speeches, just quiet people looking at something that came from silence and survival. Standing there, surrounded by strangers, I realized I didn't need anyone to recognize me to exist. Existence itself, the act of creating, breathing, choosing, was enough. When I came back to the cabin that night, the air was cool and sweet. Lydia had left a single lantern burning on my porch, the way she always did when she wanted to say goodnight without words. I sat by the lake with my notebook and wrote the last page. There's a moment after every ending where the world holds its breath, not in grief but in awe. That's where I live now. Not in the storm, not in the silence, but in the afterlight. I closed the notebook and placed it on the table beside the window, where the dawn would find it. The horizon was beginning to pale, the first hint of morning slipping through the dark. Somewhere behind the trees, the first bird called out, testing the new day. And I smiled, not because the story was over, but because I finally understood that it had only just begun.